Welcome to the EBPOT podcast with your host, Kim Griffin. Hello to my fellow occupational therapists and welcome to the EBPOT podcast, where I help you stay up to date with the latest research in paediatric occupational therapy. My name is Kim Griffin and I'm a paediatric occupational therapist and your host. My goal with this podcast and newsletter is to make recently released evidence in the occupational therapy literature easily accessible to paediatric occupational therapists, with a focus on those who are working with school-aged children. I know it's really hard to stay on top of what's been published, so I want to make it easy for you. The podcast will curate relevant articles into bite-sized summaries you can listen to on the go. In the first half of this episode, I just want to give you an introduction to the podcast. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and also what I'll be covering in the podcast. In the second half, I've summarised an article reporting on the current practices of school-based occupational therapists working in North America, just to give you a taste of what's to come. So a little bit about me. I'm a paediatric occupational therapist. I initially trained in my hometown of Townsville in Queensland, Australia, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. After a few years working in North Queensland, I moved over to the UK, where I worked as a locum for a few different services before moving to Dublin to set up an early intervention team. After 2 years, I moved over to London, which is where I've been since 2010. Throughout my career, I've worked in social care, the National Health Service, schools, and private practice. My current focus is school-based practice, and I offer online training for schools, families, and occupational therapists via my company GriffinOT. I'm also completing my PhD part-time. For my PhD, I'm exploring how teachers support children's self-regulation skills in mainstream schools within the United Kingdom. My goal with the podcast is to focus on recent research evidence that is relevant to school-based paediatric occupational therapists. So I will prioritise topics which are most relevant to mainstream school-based occupational therapists. This will include topics like self-regulation, sensory needs, autism, dyspraxia, DCD, and articles on fine motor skills, handwriting, daily living skills, and other functional skills related to school-based practice or school-based children. I'll also include any articles that have particularly caught my eye. These might be to do with general practice trends or articles from the adult literature if they have relevance to paediatric occupational therapy. For example, if there's an article on autistic adults' views on sensory needs, I'll include this as I think it helps give us insights into children's experiences as well. I won't specifically cover physical or learning disabilities unless there's a clear application to school-based occupational therapy. For example, results from an article exploring the use of co-op versus behavioural approaches for children with cerebral palsy has relevant learning for all paediatric school-based therapists, but an article which specifically explores the use of bimanual training for children with CP might be less relevant to the majority of school-based paediatric occupational therapists I'm creating the podcast for. For these articles, I will mention that I've seen them, but I won't necessarily provide a summary, as I don't think I will be able to do it justice because it's not my area of expertise. One question I was asked during my initial testing was how I choose which articles I include in the podcast. The primary inclusion criteria is that the articles were recently published in the main occupational therapy journals. Logistically, due to the time that I need to prepare the episodes, I'm usually working at least 3 to 4 months ahead. So the articles won't be hot off the press, but typically they will have been published in the last 3 to 6 months. The journals I will primarily focus on are the American Journal of Occupational Therapy, the Australian Occupational Therapy Journal, the Canadian Journal of Occupational Therapy, the British Journal of Occupational Therapy, Physical and Occupational Therapy in Paediatrics, the Journal of Occupational Therapy Schools and Early Intervention, and the Occupational Therapy Journal of Research. As part of my PhD reading, I also have alerts on sensory and self-regulation, so I will include articles outside of OT journals if I think they are relevant to paediatric practice and if I need additional articles. To locate the articles, every 3 to 4 months I start by doing a manual review of the OT journals to see which of the articles are relevant to paediatric occupational therapists. For the journals that have online first releases, I will check the articles which have been published online first, as sometimes this can be many months before they are released in a specific journal issue. I then take this list and where possible group the articles into topics for each episode. As I'm focused on recent work, there might not always be neat topic groupings, but I will do my best. I will prioritise articles with applications for a broader number of therapists, and I will mention articles that might be relevant to a smaller group of therapists. For example, while preparing for the first set of articles, I saw an article describing the translation and standardisation of a sensory assessment tool into Malay. This tool will be mostly relevant to therapists in Malaysia, so I will mention it rather than review the article, as it will be applicable to only a small number of therapists. If I have too many relevant articles, I will then prioritise based on study quality. So I'll present randomised control trials over case study designs, for example. I will still mention the other articles, I just won't do a full summary, so that therapists are aware of them and can go and read them if they're relevant to their area of practice. My plan is to release fortnightly episodes which will typically review 2 articles. Episodes will be released on a Saturday. Each episode will include a written summary and the links to the articles on the EBPOT website. You can join the mailing list at ebpot.com to receive notifications each fortnight of the episode topic and a link to the episode. Subscribers will also receive a quarterly reflective summary they can complete and add to their CPD portfolios. The podcast will remain forever free, but after 6 months, the written summaries will be available to members. In addition, every 3 months there will be a live journal club. You can book onto the first one, which is happening in January 2026 at ebpot.com. My goal with this podcast isn't to endorse or dismiss any particular approach, but rather to keep you informed about all of the research being published so you can make evidence-informed decisions within your practice. I think it's important that we acknowledge and are aware of the different perspectives that exist within our profession and that we continue to critically evaluate evidence as it emerges. I'm going to commit to an initial 6-month period for the podcast, and I'd love to reach 2,000 listeners by the end of this period. So please do share this podcast with at least one other paediatric OT that you know. My goal is to make the evidence more readily accessible to paediatric OTs, but I also need to be realistic. If no one is listening, then I'm not achieving my goal. You can let me know that you're there by joining the mailing list and subscribing on your usual podcast app. The first official episode will be released on Saturday, November 1st. I just wanted to give you a heads up that it's coming and a bit of an introduction so that you know what to expect. Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe. The links are below the podcast, and I hope that you can use the EBPOT podcast to inform your practice. So the first article I'm going to review is titled Occupational Therapy's Role in Schools, a survey of occupational therapy practitioners, and it was published in the American Journal of Occupational Therapy in September-October 2025. It's a descriptive survey by Zetland and colleagues. The study aimed to explore the day-to-day practices of school-based occupational therapists in the United States of America. The researchers surveyed 500 school-based occupational therapy practices across the United States to get a comprehensive picture of their roles, responsibilities, service delivery models, intervention approaches, and how they provide feedback to families. The team developed a survey which was run on the survey platform Qualtrics. The survey asked occupational therapists about the school setting that they practiced in, the specific interventions they used and how often, their service delivery models, how they provide feedback to families, additional duties beyond direct care, and general demographic information. The survey was distributed by the state occupational therapy associations, state education departments, and social media groups. The data collection ran from January to March 2024, and there were 500 responses available for analysis. The research team analysed the quantitative data using descriptive statistics and correlations, and the open-ended responses were analysed using content analysis with 2 independent coders reviewing the data. So, what were the results? With regards to service delivery models, the therapists used a mix of direct one-to-one intervention in therapy rooms, so what we call the pull-out approach, direct intervention in classrooms, and consultation with the teachers. The frequency of use of these approaches changed as the students moved from early primary through to secondary, with therapists reporting they used more of a consultative approach in middle school and high school. Therapists were also providing staff training, intervention in open areas like hallways, group interventions, and interventions in other formats. Some therapists noted that they didn't have a dedicated space and worked wherever they could find a space to work, which is something that certainly resonates with me in my years of working in schools. When it comes to communicating with families, the results indicated a heavy reliance on formal mandated channels. So between 86 to 91% of practitioners across all settings reported that they used scheduled progress reports or IEP meetings to provide feedback. Only about 7 to 8% used scheduled phone calls, and even fewer provided weekly emails, summaries, or quarterly parent conferences. The intervention categories were specified on the questionnaire, and the OTs were asked to identify how frequently they use them. When reporting the results, the researchers defined regular use as weekly or daily use. So in elementary schools, which is the first years of primary up to age 10, over 90% of therapists reported that they used fine motor activities and handwriting weekly or daily, and self-regulation or executive function interventions came in a close second at 85% of the time. Less than half of them address mental health and literacy needs. In middle school, which covers the later stages of primary, and in some countries the start of high school to age 13, the pattern shifted. Fine motor skill interventions were still the most commonly used, followed by self-regulation or executive function interventions, assistive technology, handwriting, and life skills. Mental health, literacy, and pre-vocational skill interventions were underutilised, with less than 40% of therapists addressing these areas. High school, which in the US is from the age of 14, showed the biggest shift. Life skills were at the top of this at 58.5%, along with self-regulation and pre-vocational skills. The use of handwriting interventions dropped to less than 30%, which does make sense developmentally if I think about it in my clinical experience. Literacy participation was barely addressed, with only 17.6% of therapists providing these interventions regularly. In terms of time use, practitioners reported that they spent half of their time working with students, and this was primarily working towards IEP goals. The remainder of the therapist's time was spent on administrative tasks. This included spending 25% of their time on paperwork and 15% in IEP meetings. So, what are the practical takeaways? Overall, this research provides a clear snapshot of how occupational therapists in schools within the United States of America are delivering services and using their time. I think the descriptions of time use are really helpful to show that we do need the 50% administration time alongside the time we spend working directly with children. I know some therapists who are directly employed by schools are pressured to provide intervention all day and are left with limited time for note-taking. But in this study, 25% of therapists' time was spent on record keeping. So if you are working within an educational setting and you're not being allocated sufficient administrative time, this study gives some evidence that it is required. There's also a clear recommendation that schools need to be providing occupational therapists with adequate space and resources, which is helpful for those of us who are working in corridors. I found some of the comments in the discussion section interesting, particularly linked to the mental health and literacy interventions and the types of service provision. I think sometimes OTs on the ground are trapped between a rock and a hard place with regards to statutory documentation. For example, in the UK, I'm legally required to work on the EHCP targets, and sometimes these are no longer relevant for the child, but it can take me a period of time to get them changed. I expect OTs in the USA are also legally required to work on IEP targets, so if these focus more on handwriting or fine motor skills, then the occupational therapist will need to prioritise this intervention as they are mandated to do so. For me, some of this change needs to occur more so at a policy level and within mandated documents like IEPs and EHCPs. And this, for me, I suppose is a focus of leadership within OT to support OTs on the ground to be able to make these changes. Finally, in terms of literacy and mental health interventions, I think this opens up an interesting debate on the OT role, which was not considered in the article. The authors identified that we need to be translating our handwriting interventions into literacy, which makes complete sense. However, if literacy is defined as including reading and grammar and spelling, these are not areas that I necessarily feel as an occupational therapist I have much expertise in, and I know that most of the teachers and psychologists I work with are much better placed to provide interventions to support literacy. Ultimately, perhaps the key question isn't whether occupational therapists can address literacy and mental health needs in school, but whether we should be leading these interventions if other professionals have more relevant expertise and consistent presence. This research could be used to initiate a team discussion about strategically matching professional expertise and availability to students' needs in order to maximize student outcomes. Thank you so much for listening today to episode 0. I'll be back on the 1st of November with the first official episode of the podcast. If you are not already on the mailing list, please head over to EBPOT.com and join so that I know you're interested in more podcasts and I can send you the link as soon as the next podcast is released. The website also has the details for the first live journal club, which will be happening in January. The link to the website is below the podcast in the notes as well. Once again, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. This podcast provides educational commentary and analysis of recent research for continuing professional development. All studies are properly cited and used under the fair use provisions for educational purposes. Listeners should consult the original sources for complete study details.